"Who was that?" Rena inquired, her captivating gaze locking onto mine as I sat in the quaint bistro, trying to process the collision of two distinct realms that had just unfolded. Her exquisite features, long dark hair cascading over golden skin, framed by high cheekbones, wore an expression of puzzlement. I paused, maintaining eye contact, and took a deep breath before exhaling slowly. "It was Jasmine," I disclosed to her. Rena tilted her head, her brows furrowed in confusion as she continued to gaze at me, seeking understanding. Then, suddenly, comprehension dawned, and the light of recognition flickered in her eyes. "That was your Jasmine?" she asked, incredulous, as her mind tried to connect what she had just seen with what she had previously heard. "Rena, sweetheart," I began gently, "she and I were together a long time ago. I haven't seen her in 5 or 6 years, or maybe even more." I explained. "I just didn't know that she was." "So," Rena began, her words trailing off. "I know," I interjected softly. "I probably need to tell you the whole story." Rena sat across from me, her gaze fixed on mine, and with a single nod, she silently conveyed her willingness to listen. 9 years ago, aside from a Goodwill chaperone church trip to Mexico, I had never ventured far from my rural home before enrolling as a freshman at Taft University. My world had been small, limited to the agricultural families near our tiny town of Benton. My parents, deeply religious, had raised me in that environment, which contributed to my naivety. They were cautiously happy that I received an agricultural scholarship at Taft, but I sensed their concern about my being away from home. Suddenly, I found myself in a dorm room filled with hundreds of other young people. My roommate Charlie, from Chicago, initially seemed a bit disappointed to have been paired with a country kid. However, as time passed, we became friends. The stories my fellow dorm mates shared shocked me. In high school, I had only held hands and kissed. Now I was hearing wild tales of romantic escapades that left me questioning their authenticity. Another surprise was that the boys' and girls' dorms were in the same building, just on different floors. One day, while borrowing a book from a girl in my freshman English class, I opened the door to her dorm floor and saw 2 girls leaving the shower room, clad only in small towels. I couldn't help but stare. They noticed, and one whispered to the other, prompting a giggle. "Hey, Owen," they called out, and with that, they playfully revealed their bodies before quickly covering up, laughing as they walked away. I was completely taken aback. Having had little exposure to the female body, their teasing left an impression that lingered in my mind. To say I was naive and inexperienced would be an understatement. Gradually, my dorm mates realized this and teased me mercilessly. Despite my innocence, I was a typical 19-year-old navigating the complex landscape of university life, grappling with the same urges as my peers. Growing up in a deeply religious environment instilled in me the belief that sex was shameful and that it should be reserved for marriage, with procreation as its sole purpose. These new revelations about relationships felt worlds apart from the moral teachings I had absorbed. The temptations of companionship challenged my religious upbringing, and by the time I reached junior year at Taft University, I was still a virgin. That's not to say I hadn't had some experiences. By then, my sexual history included one brief encounter and a few other intimate moments, but nothing more. Weekends at Taft were filled with parties, and my friends, especially Charlie and others from the freshman dorms, often encouraged me to join them. I was dedicated to my studies, influenced by my parents' strong work ethic, and so I only attended parties occasionally, perhaps once or twice a month. I focused on the science of agriculture, not intending to follow my family into farming but rather seeking ways to improve farming practices. The idea of studying abroad fascinated me. Perhaps it stemmed from my sheltered upbringing and the desire to explore the world beyond my small town. One early spring night during my junior year, Charlie convinced me to attend a keg party in a big open field near the football stadium. Red and white tents, the school colors, filled the space, and for $10, we could enjoy cheap beer. By then, I was somewhat accustomed to the party atmosphere, though I still felt torn about my inexperience. I knew I would eventually engage in a more serious relationship, but my moral upbringing lingered, making me hesitant to pursue intimacy with the same enthusiasm as my friends. As I stood amidst the crowd, I realized my friends had drifted away. That's when I met Jasmine. A drunken partygoer bumped into me, causing me to spill my drink on her. "Thanks a lot," she said, frowning as the beer splashed onto her shoulder and down her shirt. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, reaching for a napkin to help clean her up. As I dabbed at her shirt, I quickly realized the proximity of my hand to her figure. My hand froze, and I awkwardly offered her the napkin instead. She took it, but held onto my hand, her expression shifting from a scowl to a playful smile. "You're not going to finish the job?" she teased, her tone light. Well," I mumbled, my cheeks warming. She laughed and said, "Most guys would take any excuse to get closer." I opened my mouth to respond but found myself at a loss for words. "I guess we should introduce ourselves before we get too friendly," she said with a grin. "I'm Jasmine Duval." She extended her hand, and I managed to reply, "Hi, I'm Owen Isaacson." "Nice to meet you, Owen," she said, still holding my hand. "Now, why don't we find a beer for me to drink rather than where?" She guided me toward the kegs, and I spent the rest of the party getting to know her. I learned she was a sophomore at Taft, studying business, and lived off campus in a family-owned apartment. She was attractive, perhaps in a different way than some of the other girls I dated, but still captivating. With her frosted blonde hair and a petite frame, about a foot shorter than my 6 feet 2 inches stature, she had a lean, athletic build. As the evening wore on, her inviting smile and playful demeanor drew me in. At the end of the night, she asked if I would walk her home. Her apartment was located above a restaurant called Papaya, a place I'd heard of but never visited. Situated on the corner in the downtown area next to campus, Papaya featured a small coffee shop in front and a bar in the back with a lively reputation. "My brother owns the building," Jasmine mentioned, and I was impressed. We climbed the back stairs to her apartment. "I don't have a roommate right now," she said, and I felt a flutter of nerves. The brief encounters I'd had in my dorm room suddenly felt different in this more private setting. Upon entering her apartment, I hesitated at the threshold, but Jasmine, still holding my arm, gently pulled me inside. "Let's sit on the couch," she suggested, leading me to a comfortable spot. We settled in, sitting close, our faces nearly touching. As we talked, I sensed it was time to make a move. I leaned in and kissed her, and she responded with enthusiasm, deepening the kiss. After a few minutes, she pulled away. "I'll be right back," she said, and I thought about leaving, believing we'd gone quite far for a first encounter. But when she returned, she was wearing only a pair of thong underwear, completely topless. "I think I'd better wash my clothes after that beer spill," she said, her playful smile inviting me to stay. Jasmine wrapped herself around me, and I felt my resolve start to waver. As we explored each other, she playfully fumbled with my jeans, and before long, I found myself caught up in the moment. We moved to her bed, and I was filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Our first time together was overwhelming. I wasn't prepared, and I quickly realized I'd reached my limit before we could really explore our connection. "Wow, you're enthusiastic." Jasmine laughed. "Next time, we'll take it slower." When she returned from the bathroom with a washcloth, I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. But Jasmine didn't seem to mind. She helped clean up and assured me we could try again. With newfound determination, we made love, and just like that, I lost my virginity. As I lay there afterward, a swirl of thoughts filled my mind. Had I crossed a line? What was our relationship now? Did I like her? Did she like me, or was this just a fleeting encounter? I hoped for more. Jasmine curled up next to me, her warm body soft against mine, and I felt a sense of peace despite my swirling thoughts. She hummed contentedly, almost like a kitten purring, and for a moment, I was relaxed. But soon she got up to go to the bathroom, and I considered leaving. When she returned and asked where I thought I was going, I stumbled over my words, unsure how to respond. "Don't you want to stay?" she asked, wrapping her arms around me and sitting on my lap. I was torn. I wanted to stay, but my moral reservations lingered. Yet, more than anything, I had no experience with this kind of intimacy. I decided to stay, and we spent the weekend together. I began to see Jasmine regularly, often at her place. Now that my virginity had passed, my earlier hesitations felt less significant. I was drawn to her, and it was clear that she felt the same way. Though intimacy occupied a lot of our time together, it wasn't all we did. We went to restaurants, participated in various college activities, studied together, and engaged in the typical activities of a couple. Throughout those first few weeks with Jasmine, I discovered something deeper than mere attraction. I began to genuinely care for her. My roommates noticed my frequent absences, and I had to explain that I was spending a lot of time with someone special. "Who is she?" Charlie asked one evening while we were all at our apartment. I told them her name was Jasmine and that it was her first year at Taft. I explained how we had met at an all-campus party a few weeks earlier. "Is she the girl with the bleach blonde hair?" one of my roommates inquired. "Wait a second," Charlie interjected. "Is her brother the guy who owns Papaya?" I admitted I wasn't sure, as I hadn't met her brother yet, but it seemed likely since she mentioned her family owned the building where her apartment was, and Papaya was in the same complex. Later, after our other roommates had wandered off, Charlie pulled me aside. "Look, man, I'm glad you have this new girlfriend. You deserve someone good, but just be careful," he advised. "Careful about what?" I asked. "Sometimes feelings and physical attraction can get mixed up, especially with your first real girlfriend. Just take it slow and keep your eyes wide open." I appreciated his concern, but I wasn't worried about that at the moment. Much later, I wished I had paid more attention to what he said. I eventually met Jasmine's brother at Papaya. "So, you're the new guy in my little sister's life," he said, extending a firm handshake. Physically, they were quite different. Jasmine was lean and petite, while Claude, her brother, was big and imposing. I estimated Claude at about 6 feet 3 inches, considerably heavier than me but still solidly built. He shared Jasmine's features but had a more serious demeanor. "Sit down," Claude said, motioning to a booth. "Have a drink." "Just ice water for me," I replied. "Nah, you need a drink," he insisted, calling the bartender over. I noticed a guy at a back table, seemingly reviewing paperwork. He had a rough appearance, dark complexion, shaved head, and tattoos creeping up his neck. Claude told me he owned the building but didn't operate the bar or coffee shop, nodding toward the tattooed guy. "Armin runs the restaurant. I'm just the landlord. You should come by at night when this place is busy. Lots of action, lots of fun," Claude added. Perhaps I would, I thought, even though this wasn't my usual scene. Later, when Jasmine and I were alone, she mentioned that her brother could be wild and had a few run-ins with the law. She shared that he inherited the property from their mother's third husband, who had passed away. Claude was very protective of her, which I appreciated, even though he wasn't quite my type. As our relationship grew stronger, I realized we had very different upbringings and perspectives. Deep down, I held strong morals influenced by my disciplined upbringing, while Jasmine was raised without a biological father and had several stepfathers. I sensed that Jasmine had lived through experiences she might not have shared with me, and though we sometimes disagreed, we managed to respect each other's differences. Weeks turned into months, and before we knew it, the semester was coming to a close. I spent the summer as an intern with the university AG department while Jasmine stayed in her apartment and worked at Papaya. Normally, she worked days in the coffee shop, but occasionally she took shifts at the bar. We were practically living together. On nights she worked, I would stop by, sit at the bar, and wait for her to finish. The bar's patrons were definitely a rougher crowd. I noticed a certain cheapness to the girls and a predatory nature to the men. Claude, Jasmine's brother, often sat at a back table with Armin, the tattooed bartender. Claude was always friendly, but something about him made me uneasy, and I never felt completely comfortable around him. What bothered me even more was how some customers interacted with Jasmine, an arm around her waist as she took an order, a friendly pat on the back, or overly familiar hugs. I felt these gestures were too casual for someone in a committed relationship. When I brought it up with Jasmine, she would shrug it off. "That's just what happens to a girl working in a bar," she'd say, and her nonchalance about something I valued made me uneasy. I knew we needed to address it eventually. Another challenge that summer was missing the deadline for the university's study abroad program. I realized my relationship with Jasmine had interfered with my motivation to apply. Reflecting on it later, I recognized that sometimes you have to sacrifice personal desires for a relationship, but I struggled to find comfort in that answer. I genuinely wanted to study abroad, and now, as I entered my senior year, that opportunity had slipped away. Despite these thoughts, Jasmine and I maintained a steady, comfortable relationship. She seemed to take fewer classes this year and rarely spent time on homework, while my senior year was crucial for my education. I was busy with my research work and regular classes. Jasmine met my family during a trip to Benton at the end of summer. It felt like observing two different worlds. She was vibrant and stylish, her frosted hair and makeup contrasting starkly with my family, who wore functional, unembellished clothing. Despite this, my family was warm and welcoming toward her. I sensed that Jasmine appreciated some aspects of our simpler lifestyle, commenting on the positives of farm life. While she never suggested we move to Benton, I felt she gained a broader understanding of that way of life after meeting my family. Later, I reflected on my desire for her to see that there was more to life than superficial values. I wanted to help her find balance in her more spontaneous lifestyle, while she opened my eyes to different experiences in a more exciting world. Our intimate moments together only grew deeper, and much of our time was spent in her bed in the apartment above Papaya. After my more restrained experiences before meeting Jasmine, I felt like I was making up for lost time. Occasionally, when we had a disagreement, Jasmine would use intimacy to help us reconnect, which always seemed to work, making whatever issue we faced feel secondary. However, I realized we often avoided truly addressing our problems. During winter break, I returned home to spend the holidays with my family, a joyful time filled with decorations, music, and delicious food. It was also a time of spiritual significance, as we attended church services and embraced the true meaning of the season. During this time, my father, somewhat awkwardly, asked if I was still spending time with Jasmine. Yes, I replied. We walked silently for a moment, as if he was processing this new aspect of my life. Now, son, he said, his tone turning serious, as a young man, I know you have desires, and Jasmine is a lovely young woman. But intimacy before marriage can lead to complications. I tried to slow the conversation. Dad, I began, but he pressed on. Just hear me out. If you feel strongly about this young woman, I would expect you to consider a serious commitment, like marriage. You're nearing the end of college, and your adult life is about to begin. We raised you to always do your best and make the right choices. Part of my role as your father is to share the wisdom I've gained over the years. He put an affectionate arm over my shoulder as we walked. It's your life, and you get to make your own decisions, but I want you to think carefully about each step you take. Make sure you're heading in the right direction. As we trudged along that country road, I pondered his words. Why shouldn't I marry Jasmine? She brought me more joy and happiness than I had ever known. Yes, we had our differences, but I told myself those could strengthen our bond. A few days later, as I packed to return to Taft, I hugged everyone goodbye, exchanging warm words of parting. On the drive back, I reflected more on my conversation with Dad. With these thoughts in mind, I entered winter term at Taft. I had been encouraged to apply for a postgraduate research position at the university, a paid role that would allow me to continue doing work I enjoyed. One night, Jasmine and I were talking in her apartment. What are your plans after graduation? I asked. I'm really not sure, she replied. I wouldn't mind moving somewhere warm, California, Florida, someplace like that. That thought struck me. What if she decided to leave? My life was here, especially if I took the research position. Over the following weeks, I considered what life would be like without Jasmine and realized I didn't want that. Her presence, combined with my dad's advice, led me to the conclusion that I wanted to marry her. I rationalized that any concerns I had about her would be manageable as a married couple. I thought about my parents' strong marriage, which was what I envisioned for Jasmine and me. A few weeks later, during dinner at a small cafe in town, I said, Jasmine, you've made me so happy this past year. You've shared your life with me, and I want to be with you forever. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a ring box. Jasmine, will you marry me? She looked at me, uncertainty in her eyes, holding the box without opening it. You want to marry me? She asked, still puzzled. Yes, I affirmed, gazing deeply into her eyes. Finally, she opened the box and slipped the ring onto her finger, a mix of emotions washing over her face. Are you sure? She asked. I nodded, still watching her closely. After a deep breath and a glance at the ring, she smiled and replied, "Why not?" On one hand, I was thrilled she said yes. On the other, it felt like a huge milestone, and her casualness about it surprised me. Yet, in the end, she had accepted. As part of our pre-marriage preparations, we needed to address our legal affairs. We didn't create a prenuptial agreement, but we did make simple wills and purchased small life insurance policies to ensure Jasmine and any future children would be taken care of. Over the next few months, wedding planning took center stage in our discussions. I realized partway through winter term that Jasmine had dropped out of college. When I asked about it, she said she would re-enroll in the fall. This bothered me, but I kept it to myself. Our families presented some challenges as well. My family was religious and hardworking, while Jasmine's was more carefree, with drinking and occasional drug use common among them. While our wedding ceremony would be held in a local church, the reception would take place at Papaya, symbolizing the cultural differences between our families. I chose not to dwell on these contrasts and focused on enjoying the event, which turned out to be surprisingly smooth. My family seemed slightly awestruck by the lively atmosphere at Papaya, but no one was critical of the social diversity. Midway through the reception, I was talking with my mother. "Jasmine's family is quite colorful," she commented, her tone free of any judgment. I hugged her and replied, "They sure are." Later, I found myself conversing with Claude Francis. My relationship with Jasmine's brother had evolved somewhat, but I still felt wary of him. He had a dominating presence that seemed designed to assert control. He had never directly crossed me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of distrust. Still, he cared about Jasmine and was protective of her, which I appreciated. "Congratulations, Owen," Claude said, wrapping me in a bear hug that nearly knocked the wind out of me. "Thank you, Claude. I love your sister and want to provide a good life for her," I said sincerely. He stared at me, nodding as if assessing the truthfulness of my words. With a heavy arm across my back, he said, "She never really had a father figure. I take that responsibility seriously. You take good care of her, got it?" His voice edged towards something more serious, finishing with a final squeeze before he moved on. I stood there for a moment, reflecting on Claude's words, which felt almost threatening. At first, married life didn't seem too different from before the wedding. We lived in Jasmine's apartment above Papaya, and the low rent helped me save for a house or land. I expected to feel a change now that we were officially married, but life felt pretty much the same, at least for a while. I insisted that Jasmine re-enroll for the fall term, and she agreed, albeit without much enthusiasm. I tried to introduce some structure into her life, encouraging her to study more and drink less, even suggesting we attend church together. Initially, she responded lightheartedly, often joking, "Yes, Dad," and we would laugh about it. However, as our first year of marriage progressed, those light reminders began to feel like nagging. Our philosophical differences, which I had hoped would broaden our horizons, started to create a subtle divide between us. I grew increasingly uneasy about her time spent at Papaya. She still worked there part-time, both in the coffee shop and occasionally at the bar at night. The bar scene felt quite carefree, often teetering on the edge of impropriety. The overly friendly actions of some customers continued to bother me, but what concerned me even more was that Jasmine would sometimes socialize there when she wasn't working. Around the time our marital issues became more pronounced, my job situation began to shift as well. My research role at the college focused on increasing agricultural productivity, particularly through the development of hybrid crops that could rejuvenate the soil. As my research progressed and we received positive early results, it became clear I needed to be on site regularly. The land was over 200 miles away, a 3-hour drive each way. There was a small farmhouse on the property with basic amenities, but little else. I remember coming home to share my research progress with Jasmine, excited about the next steps. "This can have a monumental impact on productivity," I explained. "If we can increase yield by 20%, that could really affect our food supply." "Sounds good," she replied, still focused on her phone. Clearly, my enthusiasm hadn't sparked her interest. "Jas," I said, my tone shifting, "this is important to me. I want you to share in my life." She looked up, smiled, and replied, "Owen, I'm happy for you." It's just that sometimes I don't quite understand it all." I nodded, acknowledging that agricultural research could be a dry topic, but I believed spouses should take an interest in each other's lives. "Starting next month, I'll be down at the farm in Blackstock for 3 days every other week," I said. "So you'll be overnight?" she asked. I confirmed that it was too far to come home every night, but suggested she could join me if her schedule allowed. Jasmine didn't respond. She stared off, lost in her thoughts. During this time, there were certainly positive moments in our relationship, but there were also challenges. I tried to be open to compromise, but the carefree spirit we had during our engagement and early marriage was becoming harder to recapture. My first trip to the college farm in Blackstock was productive. I worked long hours, deeply immersed in my research, barely noticing the primitive living conditions or the absence of comforts like a television. When I returned Friday afternoon, I was eager to share my experiences with Jasmine. I found her in the bar at Papaya, chatting with Dennis, one of the bartenders who was also a student. Dennis was one of the few decent people at Papaya, and I felt relieved that Claude Francis wasn't around. I sat with Jasmine, and Dennis brought me a beer while I animatedly recounted my trip and the progress I'd made. Jasmine reluctantly agreed to join me on my next visit, and I hoped it would help us reconnect. However, our trip together to Blackstock turned into a disaster, largely my fault. I mistakenly thought Jasmine would share my enthusiasm for the research, but she didn't. The small farmhouse was run down, situated amid fields of corn and soybeans, and without a working television, she quickly grew bored. When she interrupted me while I was trying to work, I snapped at her, which only fueled her frustration. On the drive home, I tried to apologize. "Jasmine, I'm really sorry for yelling at you." "That wasn't fair," I said, recognizing how different our interests were. "I guess if you're not working on something, it could feel kind of dull." She sat quietly next to me, arms crossed, looking out the window. "Kind of boring," she finally replied, her tone dry. I took a deep breath. "Please forgive me. One of the things I've always loved about you is how different we are. You've introduced me to a side of life I might never have known otherwise. I believe our differences can make us stronger together." "Do you really mean that?" she asked, and I felt a spark of hope that her mood was improving. "Of course I do, Jasmine. More than anything, I want you to be happy." Little did I know how my words would be interpreted in the coming days. For the week leading up to my next trip to Blackstock, we got along well, reminiscent of the early days of our marriage. We shared moments of intimacy, and Jasmine seemed brighter than she had in a long time. The morning I left for Blackstock, she gave me an enthusiastic farewell kiss, and I felt reassured that our relationship was back on track. I decided to make an effort to stay connected while I was away, hoping not to get too absorbed in my work. But when I called her, Jasmine didn't answer. I tried multiple times over the next few days, feeling frustrated and worried. Finally, I reached her on Friday morning. "Hello," she answered, sounding as though I had interrupted her. "Are you still sleeping?" I asked, surprised. "No, I'm getting up," she mumbled. I sensed something off and noted her lack of enthusiasm. "Jasmine, you have morning classes. What are you doing still in bed?" "I guess I don't feel too great," she admitted, and I couldn't help but feel anger bubbling beneath the surface. I kept quiet, telling her I'd see her when I got home. That night, the atmosphere was tense. It felt different from the carefree moments we'd shared before. I suggested going to Papaya for a drink and dinner, knowing how much she usually enjoyed it, but she surprisingly declined, which puzzled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Back at the farm in Blackstock, I called Jasmine again. She answered but didn't want to talk long. When I returned on Friday, something felt off, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I believed Jasmine was happy with our marriage, but it seemed like we were just off track. Over the next week and a half, I put in extra effort to steer our relationship back in the right direction. I was attentive, overlooked some of her lack of discipline with schoolwork, and brought her flowers and small gifts, hoping to rekindle the love we once shared. While there were moments of warmth, they didn't last. Driving home one night, just days before I was due back in Blackstock, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jasmine seemed bored with our marriage. I spent my 3 days at the farm thinking about how to engage her more, reminiscing about our honeymoon in Cancun, the sun, the beaches, the fun we had. I thought a surprise trip might jumpstart our relationship. On Friday morning, I finished my work early and left the farm excited to surprise Jasmine. I rarely spent money on anything, so this would be a big treat. When I got home, however, Jasmine wasn't there. I figured she was probably at Papaya, so I headed down to the bar. As I stood in the doorway, searching for her, I heard her laughter from across the room. But when I saw her, my heart sank. She was sitting on the lap of a guy, her arms around his neck. I approached, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. As I got closer, Jasmine turned to see who the guy was talking to. The smile on her face vanished when she saw me. "Owen! I thought you wouldn't be home until later," she stammered. I turned to leave, but she hurried after me, explaining that the guy, Jerome, was just an old friend. My frustration boiled over, and I pulled my arm away from her grasp. Just then, Claude appeared, his expression fierce. "What's going on?" he demanded, looking between us. "None of your business," I replied, trying to move past him, but his grip held me firm. "It looked like you just knocked my sister down," he shot back, his anger palpable. "Claude, it's okay." "It's just a misunderstanding," Jasmine interjected. After a moment, Claude released me, though a warning glint lingered in his eyes as he brushed off my shoulders. "I just want to make sure my sister is okay," he said, but the tension was clear. Reluctantly, I followed Jasmine upstairs, my mind racing with thoughts of her laughter, her comfort with that guy, and Claude's confrontational stance. I was beginning to question how a married woman should act. In the weeks that followed, our relationship felt fragile. For the first time, I wondered if the marriage had been a mistake. Initially, I believed our differences would strengthen us, but now I had doubts. Surprisingly, Jasmine seemed more committed to making things work. She became more affectionate and engaged with my interests, which was a positive shift, even if I questioned how genuine it was. However, I was unsettled by the frequent presence of Jerome at the bar. Our apartment was just above it, and I often saw him outside in the designated smoking area, puffing on those long, thin cigars. I wasn't familiar with all the different tobacco products, but I recognized Jerome's choice of long, thin cigars. Whenever I saw him, we never spoke, but he would give me a knowing smile that felt almost taunting. One time, I noticed him with a small group outside, and again he shot me that same smirk. I ignored it, but once I passed, I heard laughter erupt from the group as if I was the subject of some joke. As much as I loved my lab work on the farm, I began to dread my trips home. My trust in Jasmine had slipped, and my imagination was clouded with negative thoughts about what might be happening while I was away. Every Friday evening, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety about how Jasmine would be when I returned. So far, aside from the incident with Jerome, I had no real reason to doubt her, but the suspicion lingered. That Friday, I arrived home to find Jasmine working at Papaya, and everything seemed normal. But as I trudged up the steps to our apartment, I noticed it was cold inside. 2 windows were open, letting in the chill. Thinking nothing of it, I closed them, but my mind started racing. I was contemplating talking to my supervisor about changing my schedule to alleviate the stress I felt during my travels. I didn't want to dwell on negative thoughts. While unpacking, I decided to store my travel bag under the bed, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. As I bent down, I noticed something disturbed on the other side. Curiosity led me around to investigate, and I found a small dark cylinder and droppings nearby. At first, I was puzzled, but as I looked closer, I realized it was the stub of a thin black cigar, the same kind Jerome smoked. My heart sank as I considered the implications. It seemed more than likely that he had been in our apartment while I was away. I thought about the community I grew up in, where such dishonesty was rare. I wanted to believe Jasmine was faithful, but doubt crept in. Jasmine texted me to say she would finish her shift at 8 o'clock, and we planned to grab pizza afterward. I had to act as if everything was normal. At Marnell's, we chatted about our days, and I concealed my suspicions, discussing mundane events at the lab. However, I noticed her drifting into a state of relaxed boredom. Out of nowhere, I asked, "Hey Jazz, why were the windows open in the apartment?" Immediately, her demeanor shifted. She looked startled, struggling to find words. I guess I was hot and wanted to cool off," she said, her tone trailing off as if unsure I would believe her. Feigning innocence, I replied, "Oh, okay," maintaining my calm expression. As she seemed to relax, I couldn't shake the guilt I'd seen flash across her face during our brief exchange. While we talked, my mind was racing with thoughts about what to do next. On Monday, I took a step I never imagined I would need to. I called a private investigator. It felt embarrassing to explain my situation, but I found someone who could meet me quickly. We arranged to meet on Tuesday afternoon at a coffee shop on the other side of town. The investigator, Paul Gamble, was nothing like the glamorous PIs of television. He looked like a kindly older uncle. I explained my suspicions to Paul, and he asked, "So you think anything that might be happening occurs while you're at the farm?" He took a sip of his coffee, jotting notes in a small spiral notebook. I nodded, feeling the weight of my concerns. "Can we get into the apartment when your wife isn't around?" he inquired. I assured him I could find out her schedule and make plans accordingly. He suggested that the most efficient way to handle the investigation would be to place discreet cameras in the apartment. If that didn't yield results, he could explore other options, like following her, though that could get expensive. "Let's start with the electronics and see what happens," he said. After coordinating with Jasmine's schedule, we settled on Thursday afternoon for Paul to access the apartment. He brought tiny wireless cameras that could be placed in the main room, bathroom, and bedroom. "They won't be noticeable, and they only activate with movement," he explained. "I won't turn them on until next Wednesday when you head back to the farm." Once Paul left, I felt a mix of nerves and sadness. I remembered how confident I had been about marrying Jasmine. My dad had always said that if I felt strongly enough about her to be intimate, I should feel equally strong about marrying her. That logic made sense then, but Jasmine wasn't like the girls I grew up with. Initially, I found her difference exciting, but now I questioned whether that came with a steep price. Tears dried. I put on a calm demeanor for the next week, convincing myself I needed to act normally. I noticed Jerome once, leaving Papaya as I returned home. On Wednesday morning, anxiety consumed me. I prayed Paul wouldn't find anything alarming and that our marriage would remain intact. I pictured Jasmine and me buying a house and raising a family, but then the thought of that cigar stub under the bed reminded me of the potential reality. Over the next 3 days, I kept my conversations with Jasmine brief, resisting the urge to call Paul for updates. Finally, on Friday morning, I called him and reached voicemail. A couple of hours later, I received a text, "Out of town until Sunday. Let's meet Monday whenever you're available." My feelings were mixed. While I longed for the truth, I felt a temporary relief at not having to confront anything potentially damaging for a few extra days. As the weekend dragged on, my anxiety grew. I must have seemed off to Jasmine. I was nervous and unfocused, not nearly as affectionate as usual. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, forcing a smile, but I could sense the falseness in my expression. After an uncomfortable week, I finally met Paul at the coffee shop. I tried to read his expression, but he maintained a neutral demeanor. He pushed a tan file folder across the table. "Owen, it's not good," he said, his tone serious. "I have more pictures and some video if you want, but this will tell you what you need to know." For a moment, I hesitated, afraid to open it. But eventually, I couldn't ignore the trembling in my hands as I revealed the contents. The images depicted Jasmine with Jerome, confirming my worst fears. I felt tears well up, but alongside that emotion, anger began to surge within me. I wanted to confront Jerome and find a way to make Jasmine understand the depth of my pain. Paul noticed the shift in me. "Listen," he said, reaching across the table. "I know you're upset, anyone would be. But don't do anything rash. I've seen too many people ruin their lives over situations like this. You need to think about your next steps carefully," he added, and little by little, what Paul said began to resonate with me. I needed to develop a plan. As much as I wanted to confront Jasmine, I didn't want to ruin my life. I sat there feeling all the love I ever have for her turning to stone. "Not sure what you're planning," Paul quietly said, "but if you're considering a lawyer, I've got a recommendation for you. Also, if you decide to pursue divorce, I have something else to share. In this state, adultery is grounds for divorce, which might make things easier if you choose that route." I contemplated Paul's words. In my heart, I knew I couldn't stay married to Jasmine. Even if I could forgive her for Jerome, I doubted I could ever trust her again. No, divorce was my only option. I thanked Paul, paid him, and asked for the lawyer's name. Sitting in the coffee shop with the incriminating photos tucked under a folder, I realized I needed to distance myself from Jasmine. I didn't trust myself around her. I thought of heading back to Benton but quickly dismissed the idea. It felt too much like admitting failure. Then it hit me, perhaps the timing was right. I decided to head over to the AG department at Taft University. Taft had an exchange research program with universities around the world, allowing visiting research assistants or professors to conduct research and share ideas. I had seen these notices frequently and had been interested in them as an undergraduate. I found my supervisor, Tim Kerwin, and explained that I was looking for an overseas research position as soon as possible. Tim removed his glasses, cocked his head, and studied me. "These are usually pretty basic," he said. I nodded, aware of that. "Aren't you still kind of a newlywed?" he asked, recalling our wedding. I shook my head, assuring him that wouldn't matter. "Owen, many places would love to have you," he began, "but I've seen married people attempt these exchanges, and it often doesn't work out well. I have a responsibility to you and our partners, to be honest. I wouldn't recommend it." I took a deep breath and, without going into details, explained that my marriage would be ending shortly and that I wanted to leave the area as soon as possible. The further away and longer the commitment, the better. Tim considered my words for a moment. "I wouldn't advise it," he said. "Tim, one way or another, I'm getting out of here," I insisted. "I like Taft and want to continue my affiliation with the university, but I can't stay in this town for now." He stared at me for a full 30 seconds before turning to his laptop. "Well, here's a posting everyone would want, Scia University in Italy, but that opening doesn't start for 6 months," he said, continuing to scroll. "There's one that's open and looking for someone immediately, but it's through the University of Indonesia and the assignment is quite rural." I interrupted him. "I'll take it." He looked up, surprised. "Here, I'll send you a link. You really need to read through this. From what I understand, the people in that area are wonderful, but it's a primitive environment. We've had people come home early from there." "How soon would the program start?" I asked. Like I said, he told me as he reread the information, they want someone as soon as possible. "The link I sent you has all the details. Do you have a current passport?" I recalled my high school church trip to Guadalajara. "Yes," I assured him. Later, in my office, I went through the link Tim had sent me. This opportunity seemed perfect, far away from Jasmine and the turmoil of my marriage. I unfolded the small note page that Paul had given me with the lawyer's contact information, John Scalia, 618 to 937. I called and reached his office, explained my situation, and made an appointment for the following day. His assistant emailed me a list of information to bring, including any proof of infidelity. Thanks to Paul, I certainly had that. That night at home was difficult. I wanted to avoid the drama of a confrontation about her infidelity. I was saddened by the end of the marriage and felt like a failure because of the impending divorce. Yet, I couldn't imagine a scenario where we could stay together. I remained quiet and withdrawn around the apartment. When Jasmine asked what was wrong, I told her I was overwhelmed at work, mentioning I might need to go down to the farm later in the week. This was my usual routine, and I hoped it would spare me the discomfort of pretending everything was fine. I observed Jasmine while discussing my out-of-town schedule. She glanced away, as if formulating a plan, and a fleeting smile crossed her face. I had a good idea of what she was thinking. The next day, I met with my divorce lawyer, John Scalia. He was pleasant but professional, with a serious demeanor and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. "Owen," he began, "why don't you give me a brief rundown of your relationship and your reasons for seeking divorce?" I recounted the flirting, the found cigar butt, and the electronic surveillance conducted by Paul Gamble. As I shared the details of my marriage, he nodded, as if he'd heard similar stories many times before, and I was sure he had. "Do you have the evidence?" he asked, and I handed him the file. He reviewed the photos silently, his expression neutral. I explained that my investigator, Paul, had other material as well. "I know Gamble," he said, still focused on the images. We reviewed our few financial assets, a checking account with about $400 and a savings account with around $3,500. I had my old Honda Civic, while her car was likely worth more. Our furniture and clothing were minimal. I handed John a copy of our will and life insurance policy. After studying the documents for a few minutes, he looked at me and said, "Here's how this will work. You'll transfer half of the bank accounts into a new account in your name. Only take items from the apartment that belong to you. I'd advise against taking any furniture today." He glanced at a wall calendar, noting the date. "When would you like her served?" he asked, explaining the process. He mentioned filing a petition with the court, noting that adultery was grounds for divorce, and he would include evidence of that in the case. I thought about it for a moment. "Why not tomorrow?" I replied. I planned to be gone in the morning, ostensibly headed to the farm but actually much farther away, wanting to avoid any confrontation. I decided I didn't want to see her again, if possible. I wrote him a check, shook his hand, and left, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Driving to campus to meet my supervisor, Tim Kerwin, I was focused on filing the papers for my overseas assignment in Indonesia. I had already emailed him the application and a mountain of filled-out forms. When I arrived at his office, he handed me a large binder filled with details about my assignment, flight information, contacts, living arrangements, and more. My exciting new chapter was beginning, almost making me forget about my failed marriage, almost. For the first time since all this began, I felt optimistic. This was going to be an adventure, and I was looking forward to it. Tim informed me about the vaccinations I needed. "You're going into an area susceptible to tropical diseases," he explained, and I noted that my appointment was set for 10 a.m. the next day at the campus clinic. Suddenly, everything was in motion. I had one more night in the apartment with Jasmine, and I wanted to avoid any confrontation. My plan was to leave early in the morning as I usually did for the farm, then get my vaccinations before heading back to gather the rest of my belongings. My flight to Indonesia was on Saturday morning, and a family member would drive me to the airport on Friday. I'd stay at a local motel and start a brand new chapter in my life. As I received several vaccinations and a stack of pamphlets about potential tropical diseases at the clinic, I felt a mix of nerves, excitement, and sadness. Afterward, I drove to the apartment one last time. I parked on the street to avoid seeing Claude or Jasmine. I knew it was a bit cowardly, but I was ready to leave that chapter behind. As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine, but I ignored it. As I was leaving, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, Jasmine. Ignoring it, I hurried down the alley and climbed the stairs to the apartment. I had already packed an overnight suitcase, pretending I was heading to the farm for work. I grabbed a large canvas duffel and packed the rest of my clothes. My phone buzzed again with several messages from Jasmine, and it suddenly struck me, she had been served. In the chaos of the last 24 hours, I had forgotten to ask Scalia to wait an extra day. I needed to get out of there fast. I finished loading the duffel, double-checked that I had my passport, and left. I just needed to reach my car unnoticed. Peering out into the alley, I felt a wave of relief when I saw it was empty. Duffel over my shoulder, I moved quickly away from the apartment. But halfway down, I spotted a familiar silhouette blocking the far end of the alley. It was Claude. My heart raced as I approached the exit. I had no issue with Claude, I just wanted to leave. He leaned against the building, arms crossed, a small smirk on his face. "Going somewhere, Owen?" he asked, his tone overly friendly. "Just heading out," I replied, trying to slip past him. "Not so fast," he said, stepping directly in my path. "I just heard from my sister. She's pretty upset, said you're not answering your phone." "Look, Claude," I said, trying unsuccessfully to get by him, "this is between me and Jasmine. It's not your business." With that, he shoved me hard, sending me stumbling back down the alley. "What happens to my sister is my business. You're going to wait while I call Jasmine, and we'll figure this out," he insisted. I knew I needed to escape quickly. I didn't want to confront Jasmine's temper, so as Claude reached for his phone, I grabbed my duffel and tried to slip by him. As I bumped into him, he dropped his phone, and I heard the screen crack when it hit the ground. "You scum," he shouted, now furious, and shoved me again, knocking me down. "You broke my phone." I scrambled to my feet, clutching my bag, and tried to push past him. "Claude, I'm leaving, and you can't stop me," I declared, hoping it was true. But it escalated quickly. Instead of a shove, he landed a punch that sent me reeling, and I saw stars. I had never been in a fight before. I had no self-defense training. Fear washed over me. I had to get out of that alley and away from Claude. "Man to man, Claude," I started, desperate. "Jasmine was cheating on me with a guy named Jerome." "Screw you," he yelled, slapping me hard across the face. "Don't talk about my sister like that." Realizing I had to escape, I feigned to the right and tried to dash by him on the left, abandoning my duffel. Just as I thought I was nearly free, his hand caught me, and the beating began. He rained down punches on me, targeting my face, kidneys, and anywhere I couldn't protect myself. I curled into a fetal position, instinctively calling for help. Fortunately, we were close to the mouth of the alley. Eventually, 2 bystanders yelled at Claude to stop. Through the ringing in my ears, I vaguely heard them mention calling the police. Claude kicked me one last time and left, and I remained frozen in fear, reluctant to move from my protective position. One of the guys who had intervened knelt beside me. "Hey, buddy, you need help? Come on, get up." "He's gone." Slowly, I managed to stand, my face bruised and bloody. I thanked the 2 students who had helped. I hurried to grab my duffel but yelped in pain as I bent down. "Let me get that for you," one of them said. "Where do you want it?" I nodded toward my Civic parked out on the street. As I limped to my car with their assistance, I checked to make sure I had my phone, wallet, car keys, and passport. They threw the duffel in the back, and I climbed into the driver's seat, feeling shaky. I started the car, half expecting someone to chase after me. Even after I cleared the city limits, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of my battered reflection. It must have been at least 50 miles out of town when I finally realized I was safe. A wave of emotions flooded over me, relief mixed with sadness, anger, and shame. I began to shake and had to pull off the highway, sobbing as I sat in my Civic, trying to calm down enough to drive safely. After the emotional turmoil of the past few days, I made myself a promise. I would never let anyone beat me like that again. I was determined to learn how to defend myself. If I ever faced another confrontation, I might not win, but I would certainly fight back, something I hadn't done when confronted by Claude. As I continued my journey away from my old life, anger welled up inside me. I was angry at Jasmine for betraying our marriage, angry at Claude for the beating, and most of all, angry at myself for my cowardice. That reaction would never happen again. A few days later, my body beginning to heal, I found myself at the airport, on the brink of starting a new chapter. I checked my email and saw a message from my attorney, John Scalia. "Your wife has been served, and the petition for divorce, with evidence of adultery, has been filed." So far, there's been no contact from Jasmine or any legal counsel. I felt relieved to know my lawyer was handling everything. I truly didn't want to see Jasmine again. Just then, an announcement came over the loudspeaker. My flight to Los Angeles was boarding. Many hours later, the flight landed in Jakarta. The first thing I noticed was the humidity. It hit me like stepping into a steam room. The exotic smells were overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever experienced, and I soaked it all in. After so much time feeling sheltered, I was beginning to appreciate how fascinating the world could be. For the first time in a long while, Jasmine was not on my mind. BMA is on the island of Sumba, and the airport is called Sultan Muhammad Salahuddin Airport. It was a bit confusing, but English was widely spoken, and the locals were friendly. After arriving, I referenced my notebook and arranged for ground transportation to my assigned accommodations. I would be living with the Effendi family, a husband, wife, 2 young adult sons, and a younger daughter who looked around 10. They primarily grew coffee and cocoa. My room was separate from the main house, resembling a small shed on stilts. The kitchen and bathroom were in the main house, where Mrs. Effendi prepared meals. Life was primitive but efficient. I worked with 8 different farms, the furthest being about 60 kilometers away, using a battered Toyota Kijang owned by the university to travel between them. I began to understand why my supervisor, Tim Kerwin, had cautioned me about this assignment: long hours, basic living conditions, and the challenges of tropical living, including insects and snakes. But I loved it. I developed a routine, and everyone I worked with was so appreciative of my help. It made the hard work worthwhile. I was also learning a lot and started writing articles based on my research. One night, after a long week, I was in my small room at the Effendi's. I had spent the week analyzing soil, understanding fertilizers, growing trends, and crop rotation. I loved the work, but I couldn't help thinking about my future. My hands were permanently stained with dirt, my fingernails always grimy, and wind-blown dirt seemed to cling to my scalp. Would this be my life, hands always soiled? It was a question I pondered in moments of solitude. That evening, I noticed the two Effendi brothers practicing a martial art. I watched them for a while, and when they took a break, I asked about it. "It's called Silat," the older brother explained. "We don't use weapons, just hands and feet." They told me that Silat was different from many other martial arts. It was not about spirituality but rather about practical combat, strikes, pressure points, and grappling, developed for use in warfare. I thought back to my vow after my humiliating encounter with Claude. "Can you teach me?" I asked. The brothers exchanged glances and shook their heads. I pleaded with them, eager for the chance to learn how to fight. They eventually agreed but warned me that training could be painful, as Silat was designed to incapacitate an opponent. They said they would try to take it easy on me, but warned that it would likely be painful. I nodded enthusiastically. This was exactly what I wanted. So, I began training with them at least 3 days a week. I sparred with the Effendi brothers, enduring the bruises and learning something completely new to me. One of the farms I worked with belonged to a family named Fozi. The father, Baki Fozi, grew coffee, rice, and sugar. He had a warm personality and a great sense of humor, but beneath that, I sensed a sadness he kept hidden. I found myself spending extra time with Baki, not just because I liked him, but also because of his 3 children living at the farm. His older son, 6, and his younger daughter, Nephi, who was about 12, were part of the family dynamic. Then there was Rena, likely in her early 20s and breathtakingly beautiful. She worked as a nurse at one of the clinics in BMA, with a golden complexion, long dark hair, a lean physique, and a warm smile. Whenever I visited the Fozi farm, I made an effort to spend time with her, even though Baki and 6 were always nearby, subtly chaperoning us. 6 was a chef at a local restaurant in BMA and split his time between cooking and working on the farm. I learned that he practiced Silat training at a studio in town, and I asked if we could spar. After a moment of consideration, he agreed. 6 was about 5 feet 7 inches and 170 pounds of solid muscle from his hard work. Training with him was a whole new level of physicality. He was strong and quick, and while I knew he pulled his punches, it felt far more intense than my sessions with the Effendi brothers. After our first sparring session, I was bruised but grateful for the experience. I had learned a lot. 6 seemed surprised when I asked if we could train again, and so it became a part of my routine to spend Fridays at the Fozi farm, training with 6 and trying to connect with Rena. I also grew close to young Nephi, who was like a younger version of Rena, still blossoming into her beauty. She often asked me about America, much of her knowledge coming from TV shows broadcast into Indonesia. I did my best to bridge the gap between her TV-influenced views and the reality of life in the U.S. My feelings for Rena deepened as I spent more time with her. Beyond her striking beauty, she was warm and caring, completely different from Jasmine. I understood Baki and Vi's protective instincts, but I assured myself that my intentions were sincere. I would never do anything to harm Rena. One Friday evening, while sharing a local beer called Bintang with Baki, I asked for his permission to take Rena out for dinner alone. Baki stared out into the twilight, his silence stretching for several minutes. I worried I had offended him. Finally, he turned back to me and said, "I like you, Owen Isaacson, but I need to protect my family." He shared a painful story about the violence that had touched their lives. Nearly 10 years ago, rebels had attacked while Rena and Nephi were with Baki and 6. They had been fortunate to be away that day, but upon returning, they found their home in ruins. Rena and Nephi's mother, Baki's sister, had been brutally murdered, and their father had tried to defend her and was killed as well. So, you see, Baki said, it is my responsibility to take care of these girls. I absorbed his words, seeing the pain etched across his weathered face. I understood his need to be protective. Finally, I said, Baki, I would never do anything to hurt Rena. He looked at me thoughtfully and then reached across the wooden table to clasp my forearm. I believe you, Owen Isaacson, he said. Weeks later, Rena and I were officially dating, which meant going out together without supervision. I continued to spend time with the Foseys, and one night, I found myself once again sharing a beer with Baki, just the two of us. I had thought a lot about what Baki had told me that night but never mentioned it to Rena. I struggled to reconcile the violence inflicted upon her family in the name of religion. Raised to forgive, I found this situation particularly challenging. Baki, I began, what happened to those rebels? The older man stared off into the distance, summoning memories from a darker time. Finally, he spread his arms wide and said, there's a word for this, we call it Mimpi Dendam. Rebels must pay for what they do. I understood this phrase to mean revenge. We wait with other families and village people. We watch, we ask questions, we find out who did this terrible thing, where they live. We plan, we find these rebels, and then we punish. I sat there, my beer long empty, absorbing his words. In my upbringing, revenge was not a concept that existed, yet as I listened to Baki's story, I found myself seeing a kind of justification in his actions. My philosophical worldview had shifted dramatically. Suddenly, Baki changed the subject. Okay, now let's talk about other things, he said with a smile. When are you going to marry my niece? He burst into laughter. That was a subject I had indeed been contemplating. I had known Rena for nearly the entirety of my 18 months in Indonesia, and we had been dating for the past 6 months. I was certain she was the person I wanted to spend my life with, but I also approached the idea cautiously, given my disastrous first marriage. I felt I had changed and matured since those days. I was no longer the sexually repressed 21-year-old who had confused lust with love. My attorney, John Scalia, had informed me via email that he hadn't heard from Jasmine or any attorney representing her. Given the evidence of her adultery, the judge had proclaimed us legally divorced. It was a simple, quick email that included his bill, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was no longer tied to my past. My time in Indonesia had changed me profoundly. My parents' teachings had shaped me, but I now had a broader perspective that allowed me to think for myself. Speaking of change, the hard work and regular workouts had also transformed my physicality. One day, while Rena and I were in BMA, I caught my reflection in a mirror. I noticed I had tanned, filled out, and gained muscle. I had an image in my mind of the skinny, pale kid I had been, 6 feet 2 inches and at most 140 pounds. The man I saw now was different. I estimated I was at least 180 pounds of solid muscle. The workouts with Six and the Effendi brothers had given me a newfound confidence. My sparring sessions had become challenging yet satisfying. In fact, I had to tone things down during my sessions with the Effendi brothers. They seemed surprised and pleased by my growing skill level. One aspect of my relationship with Rena that I approached cautiously was intimacy. Throughout my marriage with Jasmine, I had become accustomed to a physical relationship, even during our disagreements. With Rena, however, there were several factors to consider. Baki and Six were protective of the girls, and I didn't want to betray their trust. At the same time, Rena's natural beauty and innocence were incredibly alluring, contrasting sharply with Jasmine's more aggressive nature. I tried to be patient, waiting for the right moment, but my willpower was often tested. As thoughts of marriage to Rena filled my mind, I realized there was another step I wanted to take first. I wanted my family to meet her. They were an important part of my life, and it felt right for them to know the person I hoped to spend my future with. Later that second year, I began planning a trip to the United States for the two of us. I hadn't been home in nearly 2 years, and I thought this would be a necessary and respectful gesture toward my parents. When we finally flew home, my mom and dad picked us up at the airport and drove us the 2 hours to Bonn. Rena quickly connected with my family, showcasing a warmth that transcended our cultural differences. We stayed for almost 2 weeks. One day, we visited Taft University, where I met with my advisor, Tim. He greeted Rena graciously and asked about her work as a nurse in a local clinic. We discussed my experiences in Indonesia and explored potential future opportunities. "Owen," Tim began, "I see a promising career path for you. You could study for your master's online while continuing your research abroad," Tim explained. "I expect a professorship will open up within the next few years, and based on your accomplishments, you would be a prime candidate." Suddenly, a plan for my professional future became much clearer. But would Rena be happy living in the U.S.? What about Baki, Nephi, and the rest of her family? We had a lot to discuss. One thing I decided was to submit my applications online and start working toward my master's. All too soon, our time in Benton was coming to an end. We had an early flight out Friday morning, and my cousin drove us to the airport on Thursday afternoon. We needed to spend the night at the Best Western to ensure we made it to the terminal by 6 a.m. Amid all the activity of the past few days, I hadn't considered that Rena and I would be spending the night together alone for the first time, no family around to monitor us. I felt a surge of excitement about our night together. Unfortunately, Rena seemed nervous and began to act withdrawn. The usual bubbly enthusiasm she had for life was subdued. I thought I understood what was bothering her. "Rena, honey," I began, "just because we'll be sleeping in the same bed doesn't mean we have to do anything." As I lightly rubbed her back while sitting on the bed, I felt her shake and saw tears welling in her eyes. "That's it," I declared. "I'm going to get another room." I started to rise, but she stopped me. No, Owen," she said, looking me in the eyes. "I want you." For a long moment, we lay fully clothed on the bed, holding each other quietly. She admitted she was nervous and excited, fearing she might disappoint me. Slowly, she rolled me onto my back, gently positioning herself on top of me. As our bodies pressed together, I could feel the heat between us. That night, we made love, and it was an incredible experience. We lay together afterward, content, and I felt myself drifting into a blissful half-sleep. "Owen," she called softly, pulling me from my dreamy state. "Yes?" I replied, still somewhat drowsy. "Yes?" I asked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "Yes, I will marry you," she said, and I sat up, fully awake now. "You will?" I exclaimed, a mix of confusion and joy flooding my mind. She smiled at the puzzled look on my face. "You declared your love for me by taking me to bed. Now that you love me, you need to marry me." I had contemplated asking her to be my wife for months, and though a part of me had been uncertain about her response, now I knew. "Yes. Of course I want to marry you." I pulled her close, hugging and kissing her. Abruptly, I stood up and began to put my clothes on. "What are you doing?" Rena asked, puzzled by my actions. "Be right back," I said as I moved toward the door. "I need to get some supplies." "Get a lot of them." I heard her call as I stepped out, heading to the mini-mart. Our flight back to Indonesia was uneventful, filled with conversations about our marriage and future. I expressed my desire to formally ask Baki for his permission to marry Rena, and she agreed, though it was clear she didn't think there would be any issues. When I did ask, both Baki and Six were overjoyed at the news. I also called my parents, who were happy for us, albeit a bit surprised to hear the wedding would be in Indonesia. The cost wasn't their primary concern. My dad had only been on a plane 3 times, and my mom once. The thought of flying halfway around the world made them understandably nervous. I left most of the wedding planning to Rena and her family while I got back to work. I also began my graduate studies in cultural science. During this pre-wedding time, I spent more time with Rena's little sister, Nephi. At 16, she was in secondary school, and while she resembled Rena, she had a different demeanor, likely due to being the youngest in the family and having been overprotected after their trauma. Nephi was intelligent and did well in school, but she had a certain naivete. She lacked the street smarts that Rena and Six possessed, yet her innocence was genuine and pure. Spending time with her was a delight, though I sensed she was worried about my marriage to her sister. "Are you and Rena going to move to America?" Nephi asked, her worried expression evident as she awaited my answer. "Nephi," I began, "wherever Rena and I decide to live, there will always be a place for you." Instantly, the lines of worry on her face softened, replaced by a big smile. She kept staring at me, nodding in approval. My concern for Nephi stemmed from wanting to protect this beautiful, sheltered young girl from the harsher realities of life. Finally, the wedding day arrived, and 6 members of my family, including my parents, made the trip to Indonesia. They stayed at a motel in BMA, and the ceremony was held in a rented hall, arranged by Vic, who also helped with the cooking. It was a joyful event, and I was pleased that my parents had the chance to spend time with Vic, Baki, and Nephi. Everyone seemed to get along wonderfully. At one point, my dad and I stepped away from the crowd. "Son," he said, putting his arm around me, "I think you married yourself a fine young woman." "Thanks, Dad," I replied. He paused for a moment. "You know, with Jasmine," I cut him off. "Let's not talk about her." "Just hear me out," he insisted. "I never quite thought she was right for you, but you seemed so happy for a while." "I guess I thought if you were," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "Intimate with her, you needed to be married." "It's okay, Dad," I reassured him, but he continued, "Anyway, I apologize for giving you the wrong advice." We stood there comfortably for a moment, my dad's arm around my back. "I just wanted to say," he added, "I think you picked the right one this time." With that, he clapped me on the shoulder and rejoined the wedding crowd without another glance back. Soon enough, the wedding was over, and my family had returned home. Life resumed, but it was different now. Rena and I were living together in a small building on Baki's property. It was simple, but that didn't matter. We were together and close to her family. I worked my regular schedule during the week and continued my studies for my master's in the evenings. On weekends, we spent time with Rena's family and with Nephi, who was blossoming into a beautiful young woman. Her innocence and trusting nature were refreshing, but both Rena and I worried about her, knowing the world could be a tough place. As the months passed, I was surprised to realize I was approaching my 4th year in Indonesia. There were times I'd come home after a long day of work, filthy and exhausted, wondering if I would be doing this forever. One day, I received an email from Tim at Taft about a professorship opening. He encouraged me to apply since I had completed my master's. That evening, I discussed the opportunity with Rena. Although she had reservations about leaving her family, she was excited about the possibility of living in America. A few days later, she shared that she had spoken with Baki. True to his kind nature, he urged her to pursue the opportunity. Deep down, Rena sensed the sadness in his eyes as he encouraged her toward a new life far from home. About a week later, I received an email from Tim stating I was their top candidate for the position and asking if I could wrap up my affairs in Indonesia by the 1st of August, just 4 weeks away. It was a bittersweet farewell to my Indonesian friends, especially Baki, Vic, and young Nephi. The night before our departure, Nephi came to our room while we were packing. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Remember what you promised?" she asked. I paused, searching her eyes for the memory of my promise. "You told me there would always be a place for me with you," she reminded me. "Nephi," I began, "once we settle in America, we want you to come visit and see it for yourself." She sat at the edge of our bed, processing my words. After a moment, she nodded, smiled, and left. One thing about my life in Indonesia was that I spent very little money. I didn't earn much, but I saved what I could. I lived rent-free, and most of what I ate came from the farms where I worked. There wasn't much to spend money on, which led to a sizable savings of nearly $150,000 in my investment account. One of the things Rena and I both wanted was our own house. Fortunately, housing costs near Taft University were still fairly reasonable. We bought an older 3-bedroom house with a 2-acre lot about a mile west of the college, managing to put nearly half the purchase price down as a down payment. One of our considerations when searching for a house was making sure there was enough room for her family, particularly young NEI. With Tim's help, Rena secured a position at the campus health clinic. Although she had the practical knowledge to be a registered nurse, she needed to complete some classes to achieve that designation. Meanwhile, I started my fall classes and quickly discovered how much I enjoyed my role as a professor and working with the students. Rena's adjustment to life in America was mostly smooth. She was amazed by the variety of food available in grocery stores. When I took her to Costco, she was astonished by the oversized packaging. I remember her seeing a large jar of mustard and asking who would need so much. Even my explanation felt a bit absurd. However, one challenge was the distance from her family. She missed them terribly. After the tragedy they endured, they had grown even closer. There were many tear-filled phone calls in those first few weeks, but overall, our life together was wonderful. We both enjoyed our jobs and spent time fixing up our house. It was fun to introduce Rena to different aspects of American culture. Both of us worked Monday through Friday and made it a tradition to go out for dinner on Saturday nights, exploring different types of restaurants, from fast food to fine dining. It was interesting to see Rena's preferences. She loved Subway but wasn't fond of Pizza Hut. One Saturday, we decided to visit a nice restaurant near the college called Iris Farm, a cozy bistro known for its wine selection. As we enjoyed a glass of wine in the bar while waiting for our table, the atmosphere was relaxed, until, midway through our dinner, a commotion erupted. "Well, if it isn't my long-lost husband," a voice called from behind me. I turned to see Jasmine approaching with one of her friends. "You look good, Owen. You've filled out a bit, your pasty skin is looking tanner," she added with a smirk. Rena wore a puzzled expression. "Hello, Jasmine," I replied quietly. "So you kind of left without telling me you were leaving?" Jasmine continued, her tone overly cheerful but laced with sarcasm. I didn't respond, and Jasmine turned her attention to Rena, her friend giggling beside her. "And who is this little doll?" Jasmine asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Rena, ever polite, stood up, smiled, and extended her hand. "Hello, I'm Rena," she said warmly. But Jasmine ignored her gesture completely, her voice growing louder as other diners began to notice the disturbance. "Are all the massage parlors closed tonight, honey?" Jasmine quipped toward Rena. At that moment, I turned to Jasmine. "Okay, that's enough," I said firmly. "I think it's time for you to leave." Just then, the manager approached and politely, but firmly, ushered Jasmine and her friend out. She continued to shout something at me as they exited. I looked across the table at a shocked Rena. "So that's the story of Jasmine," I said. Rena stared at me, trying to reconcile what she knew of my past with Jasmine and my life now. "You knew I'd been married before," I explained. "It ended badly. It was a difficult time in my life. I guess I tried to block it out, which is why I haven't said much about her until tonight." I nodded toward the exit where Jasmine had just been escorted out. "I know," Rena said. "I just didn't know she was that mean." "Our marriage ended badly," I explained. "After the fight with her brother, I just wanted to get away from her. With any luck, we'll never see her again." I said this hopefully, wishing it was true. Jasmine was furious. The anger she had bottled up from my leaving years ago resurfaced. She didn't care what the lawyers had said. To her, I was still her husband. Seeing me with Rena only fueled her humiliation. Jasmine decided to go to Papaya to talk to her brother, Claude. She wanted payback on me, and maybe Claude could help. When she arrived, Claude was at their usual table, chatting with Armin and a couple of girls. Jasmine marched straight over and started recounting her version of the incident at Iris Garden, emphasizing how I was acting as if I was better than her. Claude listened, drumming his fingers on the table as he processed what Jasmine was saying. Deep down, he thought she was better off without me. "So, who was the girl with him?" Claude asked. "I don't know. I only saw them for a moment," she replied, frustration creeping into her voice. "Easy, easy," Claude said, trying to calm her. "Just tell me what she looks like." Taking a deep breath, Jasmine described Rena as best as she could. "I think her name was something like Rita." "Okay," Claude said, "I'll ask around." "He used to work at the college, didn't he?" He called over Dennis, the bartender, who was also finishing his degree. "You remember the guy Jasmine was married to?" Claude asked. Dennis nodded. "Yeah. Keep an eye out for him on campus and let me know if you see him." "Will do," Dennis replied, and Claude dismissed him with a nod. "Don't worry, Jas. I'll find out what he's doing here," he assured her. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your likes.